There's a strange quiet spreading across society right now, and most people do not even realize it until they feel it themselves. The places that once buzzed with noise and motion feel hollow, like a city after the power goes out. And the question nobody wants to ask is why so many men have simply stopped showing up. This is not a trend, it is not a phase, and it is not something that will reverse itself on its own. If you watch this video all the way to the end, you are going to understand why millions of men have chosen silence, solitude, and distance over participation, and why this choice is sending shockwaves through society. Before we get into this, take a second to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more angry guy content and you want every single video the moment we release it. It helps the channel more than you realize, and it ensures you do not miss what is coming next. Also, make sure you check out Angry's Crypto Academy if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth by learning how to buy, sell, and trade crypto the right way. The Academy is linked in the description of this video, so go check it out now and take control of your financial future instead of leaving it in someone else's hands. And if you are enjoying these angry guy videos and you want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description as well. It keeps the lights on, the research going, and the content coming. Now, let us talk about what is really happening, because the story being told publicly does not match what men are actually living privately. Across the United States and across much of the developed world, men are choosing to live in solitude and completely disengage from women and from society as a whole. They are not protesting, they are not marching, they are not writing angry letters, and they are not demanding change. They are simply opting out. Bars that once catered to young men are empty. Clubs that relied on male presence to create energy feel lifeless. Restaurants at night are increasingly filled with groups of single women wondering where everyone went. And the answer is not complicated. Men did not disappear. They went home, they stayed home, and they decided not to come back out. This did not happen overnight, and it did not happen without warning. For decades, men were told very clearly that they were not needed, that they were a problem, that their presence was unwelcome, and that their involvement in society was optional at best and harmful at worst. Men were told not to approach, not to speak, not to engage, not to lead, and not to expect anything in return for their effort. They were told that society could function just fine without them, that women did not need them, and that traditional roles were outdated and unnecessary. So men listened, not in anger, not in rebellion, but in quiet compliance. They stepped back. They reduced their footprint. They withdrew their energy. And what they found, to their own surprise, was peace. For many men, solitude did not feel like punishment. It felt like relief. It felt like finally putting down a heavy load that they had been carrying for years without being acknowledged for it. The constant pressure to perform, to provide, to initiate, to absorb criticism, and to navigate a social environment where every interaction carried risk became exhausting. When men stepped away from that environment, the mental noise faded. The stress levels dropped. The sense of always being evaluated, judged, or misunderstood disappeared. And in that quiet space, many men realized something important. They did not need very much to be content. Simplicity, which society both often frames as lack or failure, is luxury to a man. A man does not measure happiness by excess or display. Many men are perfectly content with a mattress on the floor, access to a bathroom, simple food, and a small amount of entertainment. For some, that entertainment is video games. For others, it is books, music, or simply sitting alone with their thoughts. And there are many men who do not even need that. They are comfortable in silence. They are comfortable in stillness. They are comfortable with themselves. This is something that is deeply misunderstood, especially by a society that equates happiness with consumption and validation. A man without a family does not require much. He does not need constant stimulation. He does not need luxury branding. He does not need approval. When his basic needs are met, shelter, food, rest, and peace, he is often more content than people who have far more. In fact, many men can live happily with less than what the average prisoner is provided. Prisoners are given a bed off the floor, regular meals, access to exercise equipment, access to healthcare, access to laundry, and access to entertainment. Many men outside of that system are living with far less and are still content because their primary need is not comfort, but freedom from stress and conflict. This is why the reaction to men walking away is not curiosity, but panic. When men disengage, entire systems begin to wobble. Economies that rely on male labor feel the strain. Social structures that depend on male participation lose stability, and relationships that assumed men would always be available as a backup plan suddenly find that option gone. Men are not leaving with noise or spectacle. They are leaving quietly, closing the door behind them and not looking back. And that is what makes this moment different from anything we have seen before. Many men now view society, and in many cases women, as a liability to their well being rather than a source of fulfillment. This is not rooted in resentment, it is rooted in experience. Repeated negative interactions, constant double standards, and an environment where effort is rarely rewarded have taught men that participation comes at a high cost. Over time, men begin to ask a simple question: what am I actually gaining from this? When the answer is stress, risk, and exhaustion, the logical response is withdrawal. What is rarely discussed openly is that men are not only withdrawing from women, they are withdrawing from other men as well. Social energy is finite. After years of competition, comparison, and pressure, many men no longer have the capacity to maintain large social networks. They prefer a small circle or no circle at all. Solitude becomes a form of self preservation. Peace becomes the priority. And when men reach that state, it is extremely difficult to pull them back into a system they associate with stress. There is also a financial dimension to this that is being ignored. Men who are debt free or who have secured basic housing and food often realize that they no longer need to participate in the traditional grind. If they do not need to work excessive hours to survive, they reduce their engagement. Some drop out of the workforce entirely. In the United States alone, tens of millions of working age men have already stepped away from full participation. They are not counted in headlines. They are not interviewed on major networks, but they exist, and their absence is being felt. This shift creates a cascading effect that society is unprepared for. For decades, men were framed as the safety net, the fallback option, the provider of last resort. When systems failed, when relationships collapsed, when financial pressure mounted, men were expected to absorb the impact. But men are no longer volunteering for that role. The message they received for years was clear: you are not needed, you are replaceable, you are optional. So they accepted that message and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Now we are seeing the consequences of that adjustment. Many women are reaching an age where starting families becomes more difficult, and the assumption that there would always be time later is colliding with reality. At the same time, economic conditions are worsening, living expenses are rising, job security is declining, support systems are stretched thin, and the expectation that the government can step in and fill the gap is unrealistic. Resources are limited, systems are already strained. There is no infinite safety net waiting to catch everyone. Men who were once considered the backup plan are not returning. They are not waiting on the sidelines. They have built lives that require very little and offer a great deal of peace. After decades of being told to step aside, they did exactly that. They stepped away, found stability in solitude, and discovered that they were happier than they had been in years. And once a man reaches that point, convincing him to re enter chaos is nearly impossible. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable because it forces society to confront its own messaging. When you tell a group of people repeatedly that they are unnecessary, eventually they will believe you. When you remove incentive, appreciation, and respect, participation declines. This is not a mystery, it is cause and effect. And the most important thing to understand is that this outcome was not engineered by men. It was the result of decades of social signaling that pushed them away. Men did not walk away to punish anyone. They walked away to survive. They walked away to protect their mental health. They walked away to reclaim control over their time and energy. And in doing so, they exposed a fragile assumption at the heart of modern society. The assumption that men would always show up no matter how they were treated. That assumption no longer holds. As you listen to this, ask yourself an honest question. If you are constantly told that your presence was unwanted, that your effort was expected but unappreciated, and that any mistake would be magnified, while your contributions were minimized, how long would you continue to participate? Most men answered that question quietly by leaving. They did not announce it, they did not argue about it. They simply stopped engaging. And now we are standing at a point where the silence is too loud to ignore. Empty spaces, declining participation, and rising confusion are all signals of the same underlying shift. Men have chosen peace over approval, simplicity over chaos, solitude over conflict. And that choice is reshaping society in ways that cannot be undone by slogans or shame. This is only the beginning of the conversation. Because once men step away, the systems that relied on them must adapt or fail. There is no rewind button. There is no reset. There is only the reality of a generation of men who listened carefully, acted accordingly, and found something they were not expecting: freedom. To understand why this shift feels so sudden, you have to understand how long it was building beneath the surface. For years, men adjusted quietly. Each small boundary, each new rule of engagement, each unspoken expectation taught men to be more cautious, more reserved, and more distant. Men learned that silence was safer than honesty, distance was safer than presence, and withdrawal was safer than participation. Over time, this caution hardened into habit. And habits, once formed, do not disappear simply because someone suddenly wants things to go back to how they were. What many people fail to grasp is that men did not leave because they could not handle challenge. Men have always handled challenge. They left because the challenge no longer had meaning or reward. Work without purpose drains the soul. Effort without appreciation hollows a person out. And responsibility without authority creates resentment. When men realized that the effort they were expected to give was disconnected from any sense of fulfillment, they did the most rational thing possible. They reduced their involvement to the minimum required for survival, and for many, not even that. This is why you see men choosing small apartments, minimal possessions, and isolated routines. These are not signs of defeat, they are signs of optimization. A man in solitude controls his time, he controls his energy, he controls his environment. There is no constant negotiation, no emotional taxation, no pressure to perform or explain himself. Every day becomes simpler, quieter, and more predictable. For a man who has spent years navigating conflict and confusion, that predictability feels like luxury. Society often misunderstands this and assumes that men are lonely or broken. In reality, many men are the calmest they have ever been. They are not searching for validation. They are not chasing approval. They are not trying to prove anything. They wake up, handle their responsibilities, enjoy small comforts, and end the day without stress. This kind of life does not photograph well. It does not generate exciting headlines, but it is deeply satisfying to the men living it. The absence of men from social spaces has created an imbalance that is becoming harder to ignore. Social venues were never designed to function with one side missing. When men withdraw, the atmosphere changes, energy drops, engagement declines, and the unspoken dynamics that once drove interaction disappear. This is why so many social environments feel hollow now. Not because people stopped wanting connection, but because the foundation of that connection was quietly removed. There is also a psychological shift taking place that few are willing to acknowledge. Men are no longer motivated by external approval. The old incentives no longer work. Shame no longer works. Pressure no longer works. Labels no longer work. Men have discovered that walking away neutralizes all of it. When you stop playing the game, the rules lose their power. And once a man experiences that freedom, it becomes almost impossible to convince him to re engage under the same conditions. This is why calls for men to come back, to participate, to engage often fall flat. The conditions that push them away remain unchanged. The expectations remain high, the appreciation remains low, the risks remain real. From a male perspective, returning makes no sense. There is no compelling reason to re enter an environment that previously caused stress, exhaustion, and dissatisfaction. Another overlooked factor is how technology has changed the cost benefit analysis of social engagement. Men no longer need to leave their homes to be entertained, informed, or occupied. Food can be delivered, work can be done remotely, entertainment is endless and inexpensive, communication is optional. When the outside world offers more stress than value, staying inside becomes the rational choice. This is not isolation born of fear, it is isolation born of efficiency. Men have also learned that modern society often assigns blame without accountability. When things go wrong, responsibility is expected. When things go right, credit is minimized. Over time, men internalize the message that their best efforts will never be enough and their mistakes will never be forgotten. This creates a psychological environment where the safest move is to reduce exposure. Fewer interactions mean fewer risks. Fewer risks mean more peace. There is a quiet grief beneath this shift that rarely gets acknowledged. Many men once wanted connection, partnership, and family. They invested time and energy pursuing those goals, but repeated disappointment, shifting expectations, and unclear rules wore them down. Eventually, desire gave way to acceptance. Acceptance gave way to adaptation, and adaptation led to withdrawal. What looks like apathy from the outside is often the final stage of a long internal process. This is also why the idea that men can simply be motivated back into society misunderstands the depth of the change. Men are not waiting to be convinced, they have already decided. Their lives have already been rearranged around solitude. Their routines are built for independence. Their expectations are minimal. Their stress levels are low. To ask them to return is to ask them to abandon a system that works for them in favor of one that previously did not. From a broader perspective, this shift exposes a fundamental flaw in how modern society values contribution. It assumed infinite male resilience. It assumed men would adapt endlessly without support. It assumed men would continue to give even when nothing was given in return. Those assumptions held for a long time, but assumptions are not guarantees. Eventually, even the most reliable system reaches a breaking point. The result is what we are seeing now: a growing population of men who have stepped outside the social contract entirely. They do not vote in large numbers. They do not participate in social movements. They do not engage in public discourse. They do not seek leadership roles. They exist quietly, independently, and largely unseen. And because they do not complain, they are easy to ignore. until their absence becomes impossible to overlook. Economically, the implications are serious. Fewer men working means lower productivity. Fewer men forming families means lower birth rates. Lower birth rates mean long term demographic challenges. These are not abstract concepts. They affect everything from housing markets to tax bases to social services. Yet the conversation remains focused on surface level symptoms rather than root causes. What makes this moment especially complex is that men are not asking for solutions, they are not demanding reforms, they are not negotiating terms. They have already chosen their path. This leaves society in an unfamiliar position. How do you respond to a group that is not seeking attention and is not interested in compromise? How do you rebuild trust with people who no longer believe participation benefits them? Many attempts to address this shift rely on guilt or fear. Men are told that their withdrawal is harmful, irresponsible, or selfish. But guilt only works on people who still feel obligated. Fear only works on people who still feel invested. Men who have walked away feel neither. They are not trying to harm society. They simply no longer feel responsible for fixing it. This is where the narrative breaks down. Society wants men back, but it does not want to examine the conditions that drove them away. It wants participation without change, effort without incentive, responsibility without respect. And men are no longer willing to accept that arrangement. Silence in this context becomes a form of communication, withdrawal becomes a boundary. Another element rarely discussed is how this affects identity. For generations, men derived a sense of purpose from being needed. When that need was questioned or dismissed, men were left without a clear role. Some attempted to redefine themselves within the system. Others opted out entirely. The men who opted out often found that purpose does not have to be assigned externally. It can be self-generated. And that realization is powerful. Purpose in solitude looks different. It is quieter. It is internal. It is not measured by status or recognition. It is measured by peace, stability, and control over one's life. For men who have spent years chasing external benchmarks, this internal shift is transformative. It redefines success, it reframes happiness, and it eliminates the need for constant validation. This also explains why men are not responding to narratives that frame their withdrawal as a crisis. To the men living it, this is not a crisis, it is a solution. It solved their stress, it solved their confusion, it solved their exhaustion. From their perspective, the crisis existed before they left, not after. The disconnect between how society views this shift and how men experience it is at the heart of the misunderstanding. One side sees abandonment, the other sees relief. One side sees loss, the other sees freedom. Until that gap is acknowledged, meaningful dialogue will remain impossible. As this continues, the ripple effects will grow, social norms will shift, expectations will adjust, new patterns will emerge. But one thing is clear: men are not coming back simply because someone wants them to. The era of automatic male participation is over. What replaces it will depend on whether society is willing to change or whether it continues to demand engagement without offering value. This is not about blame. It is about reality. Men responded logically to the environment they were placed in. They adapted, they optimized, they chose peace. And now the world must adapt to that choice. Think about that for a moment. Not emotionally, not ideologically, but practically. When a large portion of the population quietly steps away, the system must either evolve or strain under its own assumptions. We are already seeing the strain, and we are only at the beginning. When we look forward instead of backward, the picture becomes even clearer because this is not a temporary withdrawal driven by emotion. This is a structural shift. in how men relate to the world around them. Men are not waiting for permission to return, and they are not standing by for conditions to improve. They have already reorganized their lives around absence, not presence. Their routines are quiet, predictable, and controlled. Their needs are few, their expectations are low, and most importantly, their tolerance for disruption is nearly gone. Once a man reaches that state, even well intentioned attempts to pull him back feel invasive rather than inviting. This is why many conversations about bringing men back into society fail before they even begin. They assume men still want what they once wanted. They assume men still measure fulfillment through external connection, validation, or partnership. But many men have already let go of those frameworks. They no longer define success by social approval. They define it by stability and peace. And peace, once established, becomes non negotiable. It is also important to understand that men did not arrive here because they were weak or incapable of adapting. They arrived here because they adapted too well. They learned how to survive without support. They learned how to self regulate emotionally. They learned how to minimize needs and eliminate unnecessary stressors. In doing so, they built lives that are resilient precisely because they are isolated. There is less to lose, fewer variables, fewer points of failure. From a systems perspective, this is an extremely efficient way to live. This efficiency creates a paradox for society. The men who have stepped away are often the most self sufficient. They are the ones least likely to need help, least likely to cause disruption, and least likely to seek attention. Yet they are also the ones whose absence has the greatest long term impact. When capable men disengage, the load does not disappear. It shifts, and the systems absorbing that shift are already under pressure. In relationships, the consequences are especially visible. Many women were told, directly or indirectly, that partnership was optional and that independence was the ultimate goal. Men heard a different message. They heard that their role was conditional, that their presence was risky, and that their value was negotiable. When those two narratives collided, men chose the safer option. They chose not to play. The result is a growing number of people who want connection but cannot find a counterpart willing to engage under the current terms. This is not about resentment. It is about trust. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. Men trusted that effort would be met with respect. That trust eroded. Men trusted that commitment would be reciprocated. That trust weakened. Men trusted that participation would lead to belonging. That trust dissolved. Without trust, withdrawal is not emotional, it is rational. There is also a generational element to this shift that deserves attention. Younger men are watching older men step away and appear calmer, healthier, and more stable as a result. They are learning from observation rather than ideology. They see that opting out does not lead to ruin, it leads to peace. And they are adjusting their expectations accordingly. This creates a feedback loop. Each generation becomes more cautious, more selective, and more withdrawn than the last. As this pattern continues, traditional milestones lose relevance. Marriage becomes rare. Long term partnerships become conditional. Community involvement declines. Men no longer anchor themselves to institutions that offer little in return. Instead, they anchor themselves to routines that protect their mental and emotional well being. The long term consequences of this cannot be addressed with messaging alone. Another factor often ignored is how modern discourse treats male vulnerability. Men are encouraged to open up, to share, to be emotionally expressive. But when they do, the response is often inconsistent. Vulnerability is welcomed in theory, but penalized in practice. Men learn quickly which emotions are acceptable and which are not. Over time, the safest emotional posture becomes neutrality. Neutrality leads to distance. Distance leads to isolation, and isolation becomes the default state. Men also recognize that modern conflict resolution often lacks fairness. Accusations carry weight Reputations are fragile, processes are opaque. The risk associated with engagement feels disproportionate to the reward. When the potential downside is severe and the upside is minimal, disengagement becomes the rational choice. This calculation is not made emotionally, it is made logically. What makes this shift particularly difficult to reverse is that men are not seeking alternatives within society. They are creating parallel lives outside of it. They build routines that require no approval. They cultivate interests that demand no audience. They form minimal but meaningful connections, if any at all. Their lives become inward facing, and inward facing lives are hard to disrupt. This does not mean men are unhappy. In many cases, they are the opposite. They sleep better. They experience less anxiety. They feel more in control. They no longer feel constantly evaluated. Their sense of self stabilizes. This internal stability becomes more valuable than any external reward society can offer. Attempts to frame this withdrawal as antisocial or harmful misunderstand the motivation behind it. Men are not withdrawing to cause damage, they are withdrawing to avoid it. They are not rejecting society out of spite. They are protecting themselves from an environment they perceive as hostile or indifferent. This distinction matters because it determines whether solutions are possible. If society wants men to re engage, it cannot rely on pressure or shame. Those tools no longer work. It must address the underlying conditions that made withdrawal attractive. It must restore trust. It must create environments where effort is rewarded, boundaries are respected, and participation feels safe. Without these changes, calls for engagement will continue to be ignored. There is also a cultural reckoning underway regarding expectations. For a long time, men were expected to adapt endlessly without complaint. That expectation is now colliding with reality. Men have limits, they always have. The difference is that they are now exercising the option to step away rather than endure indefinitely. This shift forces a reevaluation of narratives around strength. Strength has long been equated with endurance, but endurance without purpose leads to burnout. The men who walked away redefined strength as the ability to choose peace over struggle. That redefinition challenges long held assumptions about masculinity, success, and duty. As more men adopt this mindset, social dynamics will continue to change. Institutions that rely on male participation will need to adapt or decline. Relationships will need to be renegotiated on new terms. Economic systems will need to account for reduced engagement. None of this will happen quickly, but it will happen steadily. The most important thing to understand is that men are not returning to a world that no longer aligns with their values. They are not interested in restoring old dynamics. They are not nostalgic for roles that brought stress and dissatisfaction. They are focused on preserving the peace they have found. This creates a quiet divide. On one side are systems that expect participation. On the other side are individuals who no longer see value in it. Bridging that divide requires humility, reflection, and genuine change. Without those elements, the distance will only grow. Think about how rare it is for a large group of people to withdraw without protest. That alone should signal how deep this shift runs. Men did not leave loudly because they were not seeking leverage. They left quietly because they were seeking relief. That choice speaks volumes about the environment they left behind. As we move forward, the question is not whether men will return. The question is whether society will change enough to make return meaningful. And based on current trends, that change is far from guaranteed. When we start looking at the long term consequences instead of the immediate reactions, the situation becomes even more sobering. Societies are built on participation, not just labor, but belief. Belief that effort matters, belief that contribution has value. belief that tomorrow will be better than today. When a large number of men quietly withdraw, it signals a collapse in that belief system. These men are not rebelling against society. They are no longer invested in it. And an uninvolved population is far more destabilizing than an angry one. Family structures are often the first area where this disengagement becomes visible. When men step away from long term commitments, the formation of families slows dramatically. This does not happen because men suddenly dislike the idea of family. It happens because the perceived cost outweighs the perceived benefit. Men have watched relationships turn adversarial. They have watched expectations rise while appreciation declined. They have watched commitment become risky rather than rewarding. Over time, many men concluded that stability was more achievable alone than with someone else. This shift does not announce itself with dramatic events. It shows up quietly in statistics: fewer marriages, fewer children, later family formation, if it happens at all. These trends are often discussed as abstract demographic issues, but at their core, they reflect individual decisions made by millions of men who chose predictability over uncertainty. Each decision makes sense in isolation. Together, they reshape society. The decline in family formation has cascading effects that extend far beyond personal relationships. Communities weaken when fewer families put down roots. Schools struggle with declining enrollment. Housing markets shift. Social trust erodes. These are not ideological outcomes, they are mechanical ones. Systems designed around growth and continuity falter when participation drops. What complicates matters further is that many men who have withdrawn are not unhappy about these outcomes. They are not mourning the absence of traditional milestones. They have adjusted their expectations. They no longer measure success by marriage or parenthood. They measure it by autonomy, peace, and control over their lives. This makes external pressure ineffective. You cannot convince someone they are missing out when they feel content. Social cohesion also suffers when men disengage. Informal networks that once relied on male participation weaken. Volunteer groups shrink. Civic involvement declines. Men who once served as stabilizing figures in communities are no longer present. This absence is subtle at first, but over time, it becomes impossible to ignore. Communities lose their anchors, responsibility diffuses, accountability declines. There is also a safety dimension to this shift that is rarely discussed openly. Men have historically taken on roles that involve risk and responsibility, not because they were forced to, but because they felt invested in the system they were protecting. When that sense of investment disappears, so does the willingness to shoulder those burdens. This does not mean men become reckless or dangerous. It means they become indifferent. And indifference is difficult to manage at a societal level. The economic implications continue to compound as well. Fewer men working full time reduces productivity. Fewer men striving for advancement changes workplace dynamics. Organizations that once relied on male ambition now struggle to motivate. This leads to increased reliance on automation, outsourcing, or policy adjustments that attempt to compensate for declining engagement. These measures can delay consequences, but they cannot replace genuine participation. Another important aspect of this shift is how it affects male identity over time. Men who grow up seeing disengagement as normal internalize it as an acceptable path. They do not view withdrawal as failure, they view it as wisdom. This reframing alters how future generations approach adulthood. Traditional narratives about striving, building, and contributing lose influence. In their place emerge narratives centered on self protection and minimal exposure. This generational effect creates momentum. Each cohort reinforces the next. Men observe the outcomes of withdrawal and see that life does not collapse. Bills still get paid, needs still get met, stress decreases, mental health stabilizes. These observations carry more weight than any cultural messaging attempting to encourage engagement. Reality becomes the teacher. Attempts to reverse these trends often misdiagnose the problem. They focus on surface level incentives or messaging campaigns rather than structural trust. Men are not disengaged because they lack encouragement. They are disengaged because they lack confidence that participation will be fair or worthwhile. Without addressing that core issue, no amount of persuasion will succeed. There is also a philosophical element to this shift that deserves attention. Many men have reevaluated what they owe society and what society owes them. For a long time, the answer was assumed rather than negotiated. Men were expected to give, protect, build, and endure. In return, they expected belonging, respect, and purpose. When that exchange broke down, men renegotiated their participation unilaterally by leaving. This renegotiation is not driven by ideology, it is driven by lived experience. Men learned that boundaries were necessary for survival. They learned that saying no was sometimes the only way to preserve their well being. Over time, those boundaries solidified into a lifestyle. It is important to note that this withdrawal is not uniform. Some men remain deeply engaged, some continue to pursue traditional paths. But the overall trend is clear. The center of gravity has shifted. The baseline expectation of male participation has eroded. And once a baseline shifts, returning to the previous norm becomes extremely difficult. Another consequence of the shift is the erosion of mentorship. Older men who once guided younger men are less visible. Disengaged men do not seek leadership roles. They do not position themselves as role models. Younger men are left to navigate adulthood without guidance. This vacuum is often filled by impersonal systems or online spaces that lack nuance and accountability. The long term impact of this absence is still unfolding. Social narratives often attempt to frame this situation as a problem men must solve by changing themselves. But that framing ignores the interactive nature of social systems. Men did not withdraw in isolation. They responded to incentives, pressures, and messages. Blaming them for adapting rationally to their environment does not address the environment itself. The silence surrounding this issue is also telling. Many institutions avoid addressing male disengagement directly because it challenges deeply held assumptions. Acknowledging it requires admitting that policies, cultural narratives, and social expectations had unintended consequences. It requires humility. It requires course correction. These are difficult admissions for large systems to make. Meanwhile, men continue living quietly. They wake up. They work if necessary. They rest. They pursue small interests. They maintain their boundaries. Their lives are not dramatic, but they are stable. And stability is a powerful motivator. Once achieved, it becomes something worth protecting. This creates a strange asymmetry. Society feels urgency. Men feel calm. Society sees crisis. Men see resolution. Bridging that gap requires more than conversation. It requires rebuilding trust from the ground up. And trust cannot be demanded, it must be earned. As we move further into this shift, the absence of men will increasingly shape policy discussions, economic planning, and cultural narratives. But without a willingness to examine root causes, these discussions will remain superficial. The underlying dynamic will persist. The question facing society is not how to force men back into participation. Force has never produced genuine engagement. The question is how to create a system where participation feels worthwhile again. That requires fairness, respect, and meaningful reciprocity. Without those elements, withdrawal will remain the optimal choice for many men. This is not a condemnation of society, nor is it a glorification of isolation. It is an observation of human behavior responding to incentives. Men did not abandon society because they were broken. They adapted because the system no longer served them. At this stage, it becomes necessary to confront an uncomfortable reality that many prefer to avoid, which is that systems cannot survive indefinitely on assumptions that no longer hold true. For a long time, male participation was treated as automatic, almost guaranteed, regardless of conditions. Policies, cultural narratives, and economic structures were built with the expectation that men would continue to show up, continue to work, continue to absorb pressure, and continue to fill gaps when things went wrong. That expectation shaped everything from labor markets to social safety nets. But expectations are not laws of nature. They are agreements, and agreements only function when both sides believe they are fair. When men stopped believing the agreement was fair, they did not renegotiate publicly, they simply exited. This quiet exit is what makes the current moment so difficult to address. There is no protest movement to engage with. There are no clear demands to meet. There is only absence, and absence is hard to argue with. You cannot debate someone who is not there. You cannot persuade someone who has already left the room. One of the most revealing aspects of this shift is how resistant it is to traditional solutions. Financial incentives have limited impact because many men have reduced their needs. Social campaigns have limited reach because disengaged men are not paying attention. Moral appeals fall flat because obligation has been replaced by boundaries. Each tool that once motivated participation now encounters a population that no longer responds in predictable ways. This resistance highlights a deeper transformation in values. Men who have stepped away are no longer driven by accumulation or recognition. They are driven by avoidance of stress and preservation of autonomy. This value shift is subtle but profound. It alters how men make decisions, what risks they are willing to take, and what sacrifices they are prepared to make. In practical terms, it means that many of the levers society once used to encourage engagement no longer connect to anything meaningful. There is also a misconception that disengaged men are simply waiting for better conditions. In reality, many have already reached what they consider a satisfactory equilibrium. Their lives are stable, their routines are predictable, their stress is manageable. From their perspective, returning to a more demanding and uncertain environment would represent a downgrade, not an improvement. This makes a re engagement unlikely unless conditions change dramatically. Another layer to the situation is how disengagement alters power dynamics. When men were deeply invested in social systems, they were more susceptible to pressure. Expectations carried weight because men felt obligated to meet them. Once obligation fades, pressure loses its force. This shift reduces the influence of institutions that rely on moral authority or social expectation to function. Authority without buy in becomes fragile. This fragility shows up in subtle ways. Compliance declines. Participation becomes transactional rather than voluntary. Rules are followed minimally rather than enthusiastically. Systems continue to operate, but with less energy and resilience. Over time, this erosion becomes visible in outcomes. Projects take longer, services degrade, innovation slows. These are not dramatic collapses. They are slow diminutions that are easy to miss until they accumulate. The emotional tone of disengaged men also challenges common assumptions. These men are not visibly distressed. They are not outwardly angry. They are often calm, reserved, and content. This emotional neutrality is unsettling to a culture accustomed to reading emotion as engagement. Anger can be addressed, sadness can be comforted. Calm indifference offers no entry point. It signals closure rather than conflict. It is worth noting that disengagement does not mean men have no values or principles. On the contrary, many disengaged men are highly principled. They value fairness, clarity, and consistency. What they reject are systems they perceive as arbitrary, unstable, or biased. Withdrawal becomes a way to live according to those principles without constant friction. This principled withdrawal also explains why attempts to shame men back into participation often backfire. Shame presumes that the target still seeks approval. Disengaged men do not. They have already detached their sense of worth from external validation. When shame is applied, it reinforces their belief that disengagement was the correct choice. As time passes, the normalization of male withdrawal will continue to reshape expectations. Younger men will grow up seeing reduced participation as ordinary rather than exceptional. They will plan their lives accordingly. Education choices will shift, career ambitions will adjust, relationship expectations will narrow. Each adaptation further entrenches the trend. One of the more complex outcomes of this shift is how it affects cooperation between men and institutions. When engagement becomes purely instrumental, cooperation becomes conditional. Men will engage when it directly benefits them and disengage when it does not. This transactional approach reduces the willingness to contribute to collective goals that require sacrifice or delayed reward. You see, long term projects suffer as a result. This transactional mindset also alters how men approach responsibility. Responsibility is no longer accepted by default. It is evaluated. If responsibility comes without authority, recognition, or protection, it is declined. This recalibration is rational from an individual perspective, but it creates challenges for systems that rely on voluntary assumption of responsibility. The deeper issue underlying all of this is trust. Trust that effort will be recognized. Trust that rules will be applied consistently. Trust that participation will not be punished. Once trust is damaged, rebuilding it takes time and sincerity. Quick fixes do not work. Messaging does not work. Only sustained, observable change has any chance of restoring confidence. Yet many institutions are reluctant to undertake that level of change. It requires admitting mistakes. It requires relinquishing certain assumptions. It requires redesigning structures that benefited from automatic participation. These are difficult steps, especially when the consequences of inaction are delayed rather than immediate. Meanwhile, disengaged men continue to live quietly on the margins of systems that no longer center them. They are not excluded, they are self excluding. This distinction matters. Self exclusion is harder to reverse because it is rooted in choice rather than constraint. There's also an ethical dimension to consider. Men have the right to choose how they live, they have the right to prioritize their well being. Framing disengagement as a moral failing ignores this autonomy. It treats men as instruments rather than individuals. That framing itself contributes to the problem by reinforcing the perception that men are valued primarily for their utility rather than their humanity. As society grapples with these realities, it faces a choice. It can continue to pathologize male withdrawal and attempt to correct it through pressure, or it can examine the conditions that made withdrawal attractive and address them honestly. The first approach deepens disengagement. The second at least opens the possibility of renewal. It is also important to recognize that not all men who disengage do so permanently. Some remain open to re engagement under different conditions, but those conditions are stricter than before. They require clarity, fairness, and genuine respect. They require environments where boundaries are honored and contributions are valued. Without these elements, Even tentative re engagement quickly gives way to renewed withdrawal. This selective openness creates a filtering effect. Men who are re engaged do so cautiously. They test systems before committing. They withdraw quickly at the first sign of instability. This cautious approach further limits deep involvement and long term investment. The cumulative effect of these patterns is a society that functions but with reduced cohesion and resilience. It continues to operate but with less trust and less voluntary contribution. Over time, this makes it more vulnerable to shocks. When crises arise, fewer people feel invested enough to respond proactively. Responsibility diffuses. Coordination becomes harder. None of this is inevitable, but it is directional. Trends of this magnitude do not reverse easily. They require sustained effort and genuine reform. They require listening to lived experience rather than dismissing it. They require acknowledging that disengagement was a response, not a cause. When we talk about realistic adaptation, we have to be honest about what can and cannot be undone. Some doors, once closed, do not reopen easily. Men who have restructured their lives around solitude have done more than change habits. They have changed identity. They no longer see themselves as participants in a shared social project. They see themselves as independent operators managing their own well being. This shift is internal, not superficial, and internal shifts are the hardest to reverse. You cannot legislate identity. You cannot message someone back into a worldview they have already outgrown. This is why so many proposed solutions feel disconnected from reality. They assume that if conditions improve slightly, men will return eagerly. But men are not waiting for marginal improvement. They are waiting for fundamental change. And even then, many are not waiting at all. They have moved on. Their lives no longer orbit around the expectations of others. They do not feel the absence of social approval because they no longer seek it. That emotional independence is a powerful stabilizer. One of the clearest lessons from this moment is how incentives shape behavior over time. For years, incentives for male participation weakened while penalties increased. Effort became riskier. Mistakes became more costly. Rewards became less certain. Men adjusted accordingly. They reduced exposure. They minimized commitments. They narrowed their scope of involvement. This was not a coordinated decision. It was a million small calculations made independently, all pointing in the same direction. When enough individuals make the same calculation, it becomes a pattern. When the pattern persists, it becomes a norm. And once a norm is established, reversing it requires more than persuasion. It requires rebuilding the incentive structure itself. That means reducing risk, increasing fairness, and restoring reciprocity. Without these elements, disengagement remains the rational choice. There is also an important distinction between visibility and reality. Many disengaged men are invisible to public discourse because they are not creating problems. They are not demanding attention. They are not occupying spaces that generate headlines. Their lives are quiet. Their needs are minimal. This makes it easy for institutions to underestimate their numbers and their impact. But absence has weight, silence accumulates, and eventually it becomes undeniable. And another uncomfortable truth is that some systems benefited from male overextension. They relied on men to fill gaps without adequate support or recognition. When men withdrew, those gaps became visible. The resulting strain is often misattributed to external factors rather than internal design flaws. This misattribution delays meaningful reform and reinforces disengagement. It is also worth examining how language shapes perception. Discussions about male withdrawal often frame men as abandoning responsibility, but responsibility implies consent. When responsibility is assigned without agency, it ceases to be responsibility and becomes burden. Men did not abandon responsibility. They withdrew consent from arrangements they no longer considered fair. That distinction matters because it reframes the issue from moral failure to contractual breakdown. Understanding this breakdown requires listening to what men have done rather than what they say. Many disengaged men are not vocal. They do not write manifestos. They do not organize movements. Their actions speak for them. They simplified their lives. They reduced obligations. They prioritize peace. That is their statement. There is a tendency to assume that disengagement must lead to long term dissatisfaction or regret. But this assumption reflects a misunderstanding of male psychology. Men often experience fulfillment through stability rather than stimulation, predictability rather than novelty, control rather than expansion. Solitude provides these in abundance. For many men, the trade off feels worthwhile. This does not mean that all men thrive in isolation. It means that a significant number find it preferable to the alternatives currently available. That preference alone is enough to sustain the trend. People do not abandon what works for them simply because others disapprove. As this reality settles in, some institutions may attempt to compensate by redistributing expectations, but redistribution without buy in creates further imbalance. When responsibility is shifted without addressing underlying trust issues, resentment grows. The cycle continues. Engagement declines further. What this moment reveals is the fragility of systems built on unexamined assumptions. When participation is assumed rather than earned, systems become brittle. They function until they do not. And when they fail, they often fail quietly at first, through attrition rather than collapse. The path forward, if one exists, requires humility. It requires acknowledging that disengagement is not a problem to be fixed, but a signal to be understood. Signals convey information. Ignoring them does not eliminate the message, it simply delays response. One potential adaptation is the acceptance of reduced participation as a new baseline. This would require redesigning systems to function with lower engagement rather than trying to restore previous levels. Such redesigns are difficult, but not impossible. They require efficiency, automation, and realistic expectations. They also require letting go of narratives that no longer match reality. Another adaptation involves rebuilding trust incrementally. This means creating environments where engagement is optional, boundaries are respected, and contributions are genuinely valued. It means demonstrating fairness consistently over time. Trust cannot be rebuilt through declarations, it must be earned through behavior. However, even with these adaptations, it is unlikely that engagement will return to previous levels. Too much has changed. Too many men have found alternatives that work for them. The goal, if one exists, should not be restoration, but stabilization. This moment also offers a broader lesson about human behavior. People respond to incentives, they seek equilibrium, they withdraw from environments that cause harm. These truths apply regardless of ideology. Ignoring them leads to predictable outcomes. As we approach the later stages of this discussion, it becomes clear that male withdrawal is not an anomaly. It is a case study in adaptation. Men adapted to a changing environment in ways that preserved their well being. That adaptation has consequences, both intended and unintended. The challenge now is whether society can adapt in return. Adaptation requires letting go of expectations that no longer serve reality. It requires designing systems that align with actual behavior rather than desired behavior. This is difficult work, but it is necessary. The alternative is continued drift, continued erosion of participation, continued strain on systems built for a different era. Drift is comfortable in the short term because it avoids hard decisions, but it compounds problems over time. As this continues, narratives will shift. What is now framed as disengagement may later be seen as early warning. What is now criticized may later be understood as foresight. History often reinterprets quiet exits more kindly than loud failures. For the men who have already stepped away, none of this changes much. Their lives remain stable. Their choices remain rational within their context. They are not waiting for validation. They are living according to priorities they have chosen. For those still engaged, the landscape will continue to change around them. Expectations will adjust. Norms will shift. The absence of automatic participation will force recalibration. As we bring all of this together, it is important to slow down and separate emotional reactions from clear observation. This topic triggers strong responses because it touches identity, expectations, and deeply held beliefs about how society is supposed to function. When those beliefs collide with reality, discomfort is inevitable. But discomfort does not mean something is untrue. Often it means something has changed and we are late in acknowledging it. Men withdrawing into solitude is not a fantasy, a talking point, or a scare tactic. It is an observable pattern that has been forming quietly for years, and now it has reached a point where it can no longer be ignored. One of the most common emotional responses to this reality is denial. Denial feels safe because it allows existing narratives to remain intact. If men are just going through a phase, if they are just immature, if they will eventually come back, then nothing fundamentally needs to change. But denial collapses under long term observation. Men are not returning, they are not aging out of this mindset. Many are becoming more committed to it over time. Solitude is no longer a temporary refuge. For many, it is a permanent structure. Another reaction is anger. Anger seeks someone to blame. It looks for a villain. It demands accountability. But anger misunderstands the nature of withdrawal. Men did not leave to punish anyone. They left because the cost of staying exceeded the benefit. Blame does not reverse that calculation. In fact, blame reinforces it. When men see hostility directed at their choice to disengage, it confirms their belief that distance was the correct decision. There is also fear, though it is rarely named directly: fear of loneliness, fear of instability, fear of a future that looks nothing like the one that was promised. Fear often expresses itself as criticism, mockery, or moralizing, but fear cannot coerce participation. It can only reveal how dependent systems were on assumptions that no longer hold. What gets lost in these reactions is the most important insight of all. Men walking away did not happen because men suddenly changed. It happened because the environment changed and men adapted. Adaptation is not rebellion, it is survival. Men adjusted their behavior to preserve mental health, stability, and peace. That adaptation has consequences, but it is not irrational or malicious. It is also crucial to understand that this conversation is not about hostility between men and women or men in society. It is about incentives, boundaries, and trust. When trust erodes, participation declines. When boundaries are violated, withdrawal increases. These dynamics are universal. They apply to individuals, organizations, and entire cultures. For men who have stepped away, the emotional tone is not rage, it is relief. Relief from constant vigilance, relief from unclear expectations, relief from environments where effort felt dangerous rather than rewarding. That relief is powerful. Once experienced, it becomes a reference point. Any future engagement is measured against it. If engagement threatens peace, it is declined. This is why many men are no longer interested in arguments about what they should do. They are focused on what works. They have simplified their lives, not because they failed to achieve more, but because they realized more did not improve their well being. Less noise, less obligation, less risk. These reductions created space for calm. Calm became the priority. From the outside, this can look like apathy, but it is not apathy. It is discernment. It is the ability to say no without anger, to disengage without drama, to live quietly without explanation. That quiet strength is often misread because it does not conform to familiar scripts. As this shift continues, it will force difficult questions that cannot be avoided forever. What happens to a society when large numbers of capable men choose not to participate beyond the minimum required for survival? What happens to social systems built on endless contribution when contribution becomes optional? What happens to narratives about progress when fewer people believe in them? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. There are no simple answers. There is no single policy, no slogan, no campaign that can reverse this trend overnight. Meaningful change would require sustained effort, fairness, consistency, and humility. It would require acknowledging that disengagement was a response, not a cause. It would require rebuilding trust slowly, without entitlement or expectation. Even then, many men will not return, and that reality must be accepted. People do not owe participation simply because participation is desired. Autonomy matters. Choice matters. Peace matters. Any future that ignores these truths will repeat the same cycle under a different name. For individuals watching this, the most important takeaway is clarity. Understand what is happening without exaggeration or denial. Observe patterns rather than reacting to headlines. Pay attention to incentives, not just intentions. Whether you agree with these choices or not, they are shaping the world you live in. For men, this is a reminder that choosing peace is not weakness, it is self respect. For others, it is a reminder that systems only function when they align with human behavior, not when they demand sacrifice without reciprocity. Before we end, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed here? Do you agree with this analysis or see it differently? Are you noticing these changes in your own life or community? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts because this conversation matters and it deserves more honesty than it usually gets. And with that, like the video if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.